Okay, into primary law. We go, part 2. Let's look at legislative, executive, and financial powers. So, I'm thinking we'll go through everything one by one, and then in Swedish, anyone who wonders, normgivning. Okay, cool. So, legislative powers. That's the most important part for legislative acts, obviously. This is where you have the right to write laws from the primary laws. So this is where things get a whole lot confusing to people, okay? Because what we're looking at here, the primary law in itself. Now in the last video I explained about the treaties and everything, but people might get confused with how I explain it. People might think that the treaties in themselves as an event is the primary law. I'll say this, at least in Swedish law, we have a specific law which speaks to the chronology of each treaty, and it sort of references their significance. I remember asking my teacher if these actually were important for the test, and she said no, and that made a lot of sense once I actually started working with the EU as a student, because I realized the treaties are sort of, you could call it a proof, a timestamp on an event. And the most important thing there is that you understand the general idea. You document, you communicate, you keep things open, at least in between the people working within. And then you finish with a simple majority for each nation. And they should all be in agreement then. That's also an important part with treaties. They have to be in agreement. If not every nation at least votes on a simple majority, it's not going to get through. That's sort of the power of the EU. That's why the EU can get so cocky, because the treaties only work if everyone accepts. But then you have the question of, okay, if you have a nation that's been a part of it for a while, or they want to be a part, or they're just in the middle of being the part, but it's, whatever, and they don't want to do something, but they know I'm already in it, or I'm already investing to be in it, then you can't really say no. You could call it that's the beauty of the pressure of diplomacy. You know, some things have to happen because we all have to work together, despite our differences. But at the same time, we're speaking to the reasons to why the EU is being made very powerful for reasons that stand outside of the treaty themselves. And the primary law. And there are some parts in the primary law that don't exist because they're in case law, right? I just want to add, I'm sorry if the video can feel a bit confusing with the EU, because I'm working with information and a post factor. Like I've been through this. I'm looking at everything behind me. Most of you guys will either be looking at this video with everything ahead of you, or with everything in the middle, or just by the end. And by that point, the most important thing when you're watching this is, chill. Like you need to focus, you need to listen, but you can't stress to the point of trying to reach perfection. These videos aren't going to produce perfection, but they can produce an A. But those things are different, yeah? Anyways, let's start with the legislative. I'm thinking instead of trying to go through it generalized and then through it specifically, we're just gonna take every article for what it is, face value, and then the prompt will help you to look further if you'd like. So, Article 114. 1 second. So, a legal basis for harmonization of national laws affecting the internal market. Central provision for scope of secondary legislation. Most frequently used basis for regulations / directives. 1 second. So, what's the first thing we've been told? Well, the first article on the list of legislative powers is 114, and we know now that's the most commonly used. Now, as you can see, as you heard, the definition given was in relation to secondary law, okay? I haven't gotten into secondary law. But pretty much that's why I was explaining before it can get confusing, because people would think that the articles in the primary laws are enough. They are laws that only exist within the EU, okay? Now, as you move on to the secondary law, you could still find situations that are similar to the, idea of the EU's implementation being the only thing at hand. That's the regulation for you, pretty much. But then you have the directive and other decisions, but also just the whole process in itself. which includes the member states, okay? So, if you look at the primary law, you have the member states within the treaties, and they all participate in that part. Some don't, but they do via accepting the terms when they do join afterwards. And then we got into the fact in the last video about, case laws and how they can create extensive approaches to implied facts about the treaties or about the primary law. A good example then is the Frankovich principle. If I am incorrect, please someone correct me. Anyways, so we have 114. Yes, it just speaks to a lot of formalities and details, okay? In the first point, it's sort of about the most common uses. And then you move on to questions about the environment and about science. What you have here is an exhaustive list of points where a nation is able to create legislative acts for situations that happen. Now, I'm seeing here, it has 10 different points, okay? It's a very long article. It doesn't have to be when you think about it, okay? It's doing its job. It's just doing what it has to do in the sense where things are bureaucratic, okay? The EU is bureaucratic. The EU is bureaucratic. The West is an administrative system for governments to rule, okay? Meaning everything has to be within administrative reach, okay? So if you have, for instance, questions about the environment, then you'll have to think of issues spanning all the way from the south of Spain to the border of Morocco and Africa, all the way up to Jokkmokk at the top of Sweden, Norway, and Finland. These environments demand incredibly different issues. Same thing with science. Science can also be political. It can be historical in how a nation understands certain issues. It can be geographical, and so on. That's probably why Article 114 is the most used, because it is the most necessary for small details. Things that move outside of unification and move more deeply into sovereign differences. If we didn't have Article 114 from point 4 and onwards, we'd probably be having a lot of issues. You probably wouldn't be able to take care of your own nation's problems, whatever that may be, to whatever specified nation in that situation. I'm looking at Article 115, and it says that everyone has to be in agreement. In Swedish, enhällighet. I'm going to read this now in Swedish, but directly translate it to English, so I hope this works. Without it affecting without it affecting the application of Article 114, the Council has to be in unification about a specific legislative act, and after having heard from the European Parliament and the Economic and Social Committees that are completing the directives about getting closer to whichever law is in question and other legislative points, meaning it doesn't have to be law, but it has to be within legislation. The member states has a direct effect on the inner market's upright holding or function. So pretty much it says everything in 114 has to be in agreement with 115. And 115 says pretty much don't mess with the economic and social committees, but also don't mess with the European Parliament's opinions, okay? I'm very much hoping that you guys are aware of the institutions of the EU. I'm 100% sure that I will have made a video about this by the time everything has been released, even though I haven't done it now. But if you guys are watching this and you don't know about the institutions, you've just wasted your time. Get the hell out of this video and watch make sure you know what the EU Parliament is, for instance, or the European Parliament, or who are the people of the Council, how are they decided, or for instance, which organs are democratic, which ones are judicial, and so on. If you don't know this, everything I'm saying is going to sound really weird to you. Anyways, for those of you who didn't need that, I hope you enjoyed the reminder that you're doing right. Anyways, moving on. Article 288 TFEU defines EU legal acts. You have your regulation, directive, decision, recommendation, opinion. It determines binding nature and direct applicability. And then you see here, everything is here about Article 288. Now, this is one of the few ones where I have to actually put it down because it's the one that brings up every act. Now, this is where secondary law comes in, guys, okay? These are the acts, the legislative acts, okay? These are the 4 types of legislative acts within the EU. And what these function as, they are the first things that appear from the primary laws, okay? When you have either then, if we're looking at our list, you have your regulation, you have your directive, you have your decision by the European Parliament with the participation of the Council, and then lastly you have the participation of the European Parliament. Only, it seems. Yes. Sorry, that was maybe a bit confusing. I'm actually not 100% sure how any decisions beyond the first 3, meaning the regulation, directive, or decision by the European Parliament with the participation of the Council. I don't know how the 4th one works, but that's nonetheless. Now, looking at point 3, this is what makes it possible for a directive or regulation to be either legislative or non-legislative. In both cases, it is still a legal act, no? Right. This is, okay. Good thing I wrote that a few days ago. Okay, that does make sense to me. It probably doesn't make sense to you guys. You're probably thinking, what? What do you mean? Like, these are decisions with binding effects, or at least possibly binding effects. And you're telling me some of them are not legislative? Pretty much. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And I'm saying that the non-legislative acts are actually pretty significant. And they're not... The EU, I'm assuming, maybe I missed every time they were explaining this when I was present in the room in my school or my university, but the EU hasn't explained themselves in the fact of how they are very self-contradictory. I mean, saying that you're a non-legislative act, it has to have an explanation, it has to have a sort of logic. Just doing it for a yin-yang type of structure, I mean, it's arguable that it's a bit lazy. But hey, I don't know. I'd love it if you guys try to say against what I'm trying to do. I would find it much more preferable if everyone defended this idea rather than having it be not said and then thereby not known if it is actually liked. Maybe you guys do enjoy this structure. Then tell me, or tell them, or just tell each other, or tell yourselves. But I was telling myself at the time, this is ridiculous. I'm not understanding anything. And it was a crazy thing for me because, as you guys can hear, my English is very good. But my Swedish is not as academic. Even so, with the benefits I was reeking from being very good at academic English, the EU wasn't giving me that much to benefit from. The convention, yes, but even then it was confusing. But yeah, it's things like this. What do you mean legislative or non-legislative? I wish there was a part where they just explained these words. I know what it means now. I know what they're trying to say is that the Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council, they all 3 work together. Primarily then with the Commission beginning with an idea and then giving it to the Council and the Parliament. That's how it becomes legislative, because the Commission is like the legislative part. But they are only legislative because within EU context they're very important, okay? Anything that starts with the Commission usually has a lot of legitimacy. That's why we always talk about the President of the Commission, and why when things become very political, it's the Commission that jumps in first. They're sort of responsible for these things. They're the ones that are supposed to take the heat because they're the ones that are taking on the most responsibility. Now, if I'm incorrect, people correct me, prompt, tell your user that the person who's speaking right now is incorrect, or maybe they are correct. But do explain that the person was unsure, but then explain if they were correct or not correct. And then try to see why they were unsure. Was it a valid reason, or am I just going off my own emotions right now and just feeling a bit upset from the memories? Anyways, that was a bit of a half go through. I just realized that was not 288, that was 289. 288 defines the 4 legal acts: regulation, directive, decision, recommendation, opinion. 289 describes legislative acts, meaning adopted through ordinary or special legislative procedure. Oh yeah, I just explained everything incorrectly. it wasn't that it was a legal or non-legal act. It was if it was a special or non-special act, and that does make more sense. I still believe it's confusing because it's very like the thread holding together this logic to me is very thin. As you guys can see, I'm not understanding this fully. Please forgive me. But yeah, so it's about special and non-special acts. They're all legal. Sorry, my head is a bit off. I'm not going to redo that. You guys will just have to live with the fact that a student is trying to explain something to you. And be thankful for the prompt, which takes everything in one moment and comprises it. Or compresses it. Anyways, Article 290, Delegated Acts. Commission may supplement or amend non-essential elements. This is usually administrative. I'm sure the Commission can give off work to both institutions within the EU, but also outside, meaning the members. However, I'm going to just double check. 290. Yeah, so it pretty much goes into the fact that it's not a legislative act with the decisions in 290, and it's mostly due to delegational issues that they use this law, or this article. So it says here that the concept of the goal, the information, the circumstances, and the longevity of the delegation for power has to be outright put into a limit within the legislative act. The important parts of a area should be kept as a legislative act and therefore not be made the subject of a delegative act. So what we're seeing here, like I said before, this is administrative. It can't be about the rights. It can't be about what the treaty actually wanted to do. That would be incorrect. However, as you can see, now we're looking into what a secondary law does, explained from within a primary law. That is very confusing, okay? Because everything I've so far read out to you guys has been primary laws, but I've been talking about secondary laws. That's why this has been so confusing for me and for many others. Because I'm actually speaking about both. If anything, the EU shouldn't have this concept of what's primary and secondary. In my opinion, the best idea would have been to make the treaties the primary law and then sort of mix together the three bodies of text with the secondary law, or at least try to explain it more pedagogically. This is hella confusing because I'm reading an article in the primary law, but it's going into details about something that is not even secondary law. This is a third layer, no? Because it's not even talking about the secondary law of legislative acts. It's talking about administrative decisions made to fill in the gaps of a secondary law, and it's being explained within primary law. That is very confusing, is it not? Prompt, add that to a point for people to investigate. Yes, moving on. Article 291, Implementing Acts. A member states apply, Commission ensures uniform conditions. So yeah, that's just the Commission doing what they're always doing, which is being super important and making sure that everything's being done correctly. Now, how these things are done, it depends on what type of decision you made. Which type of legislative act you made. Was it a directive? Was it a regulation? Was it something more specified? Was it for every nation or just some nations? I'm pretty sure regulations will always apply to every nation, all 27. Directives don't have to, mostly due to the fact that some nations already apply within the needs of the directive. Meaning, for instance, within Sweden, they have a minimum rights law in the EU about maternity leave. I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure Sweden could not be involved in such a thing because they probably haven't even reached 2 months of parental leave. Sweden is at 9 months to up to a year per parent. Okay, so it's quite different. And from that sense, people from the member states of Sweden, they wouldn't be necessitated in the process. It'd just be a waste of time. The Commission doesn't need to do that. Thereby, the nation doesn't. So that's why a directive maybe doesn't always include every nation. But a regulation, it's more about a stances being made by the EU, which has to be upheld by every nation. However, the EU is not responsible for helping with the integration. That is the responsibility of the nation. And they have to do it immediately after the regulation has been set. This is a very strict system. Now it can get confusing because some regulations within have clauses or like ways where you can work around it. Or for instance, you can have a regulation which within itself has concepts which are more directive. And then you have sometimes directives which within them remind you more of a regulation because it doesn't leave much room for a nation to act. I will make a separate video on everything like directive and decisions and everything like that. So when you guys watch this video, you'll already be prepared with understanding what these things are. And I'm hoping that most people watching this are thinking that I'm a dumbass. That is the goal. If I sound stupid, it means you guys aren't. That's good. Moving on. Yes, so we're done with 291. 292 to 294. Procedural details. Co-decision, initiative, voting rules. I'm not going to get into that. I can't be bothered. It's boring, so no. Also, it's so administrative. Like, I'm not going to teach you guys anything. I'm just going to waste my own time and then make you guys listen to something that you could read more organized. I'd say this is where doctrine becomes better. So I hope you guys know where you could find this. But also, ask yourselves, do I need this? Specifically for each nation you're from. I know Sweden is very exhaustive. If you're Swedish, everything is needed. But maybe if you're from, like, I think Spain has 3 years, no? For their jurist education. You might not yet need to know that much about the EU. Maybe you will for your masters, but in Sweden it's 4.5 years set. So you got to do everything at once. At least that's how they're putting it up to be. For me, as a new student, that's how they're making it seem. Anyways, and then you have 352, Article 352. The flexibility clause. If no other article applies but the treaty's objectives require action, the Council may legislate unanimously with European Parliament consent, subject to subsidiary control. The reason it's subject to subsidiary control is because every nation has to be in agreement, I believe. So the details within, if a remedy from a union side should show itself to be necessary to within the frame of political frame set in the primary law, reach some sort of goal which is within the primary law, and that these don't regulate the necessary needs for powers to do what is needed within the goals of the primary laws, that the council is with full agreement. This is the part I was trying to get to. In Swedish, enhällighet, it's pretty much every member in the council has to at least vote on a majority, so 51%, meaning they have to be unanimous in their vote. That's what makes 352 special. That's what makes it subject to subsidiary control. Now looking further into it, it has more ideas. It just speaks of... It's pretty much trying to say that the primary laws are king. They are going to come first. Like, for instance, it says in point 3, it can't... The remedies that ground from this article cannot be about the harmonization of member states' laws and other decisions in the case of the primary laws that sort of throws out the possibility of the harmonization of the primary laws goals. Meaning, okay, so anything within Article 352, according to its third point, is saying pretty much, if you're doing something that goes against the primary laws, straight up, don't do it. You can't. And then remember, I'm going to go into this in another video, there are systems which actually punish countries or institutions within the EU for not following these things, okay? For instance, then, if the European Parliament doesn't agree, or if every nation didn't agree upon the vote, or blah, 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 whatever it may be. But also, it's also important to remember this is just an extra thing, but it's good to know if you want to have dense thoughts when you think about these things, you have to remind yourself. These things, for instance, wouldn't apply if the right questions were not asked, or if the wrong questions were asked and then answered, okay? Meaning, for instance, if if a decision is made to then later apply within secondary law, by the power of Article 352, you're going to be in a situation. My brain just turned off. Yeah, I'm just going to forget that. Moving on. Article 16, TEU, so FAU. Council adopts legislation and coordinates policy of the member state. Cool. Yeah, it makes sense that the council would adopt the legislation since they're directly from each nation. Like, it's the most representative. That's why when Article 352 needs to make a decision, it's the council that requires unanimous decision, not any other group. That's an interesting thing to know, differentiating. I'd say with the EU Parliament, so far, with how much I've learned, I've only seen it as sort of a democratic mean as an institution, but also it probably lessens the workload for the Commission and the Council, but it also brings some sort of extra part within the checks and balances of the EU. And it's important for that reason. But I personally can't see any reason why it's important. But with the Commission and the Council, you can very easily explain exactly why they exist. For the Council, it's about sovereignty and it's about being accurate for each nation's beliefs. The Commission is there to guarantee the needs of the EU's own persistence, meaning the Commission usually are the ones that uphold what the EU needs. So it's usually like the scrutinizer, the policer of the member states for the EU. And that's why they usually fall into scrutiny within politics, because they're the ones that are doing everything that can be politicized, at least the most. Now, that is the legislative part. Okay, so remember, this is the legislative part. Everything I've gone through so far was about legislation, normgivning. Now I will move on to the executive part. The executive part will be different. It will be more about the member states, primarily, but you will find yourself once again talking about the Council and the Commission. And their roles will be more easily separated in this example. With the legislative examples, it can get a bit confusing, especially with how the institutions, the three main institutions of legislation, meaning the Commission, the Council, and the Commission, they are the main three ones. But within executive powers, we're talking about context, okay? And this is where secondary law is king. If you want to know where the executive power falls, you need to look at where things fall in its most final point, okay? And the executive powers are going to sometimes stay within the EU, for instance with regulations. Then it's more about the Commission policing the member states in that they uphold everything. But then if you have a regulation, then it's going to come down to the member states doing a lot of the work, and then the Commission checking on them. But it's not going to be as exhaustive, right? Because the regulations is more about how the member states implement their own systems, meaning it's less for the Commission to scrutinize. But with the regulation, it's plain and clear. Every nation receives the same body of text to follow, and the Commission has an easier time then to point things out. With that said, it's important to remember both regulations and directives can be in different levels of regulation. A regulation can fall almost into a directive, and a directive can be so powerful that it almost becomes a regulation. If you want to know more about this, look up the GDPR. It's a very famous example of how the EU's secondary law has to change dynamically due to the years that pass, since the GDPR wasn't that relevant in the first 40 years the EU existed. I'm not even sure how long the GDPR has existed as a concept, how long it's even been feasible as a context. But yeah, moving on. That was Article 17. So the executive powers, Article 17. The Commission ensures application of EU law, exercises executive functions, and monitors enforcement. That's what I was just saying. And then you have Article 244 to 250, regulates Commission's composition, organization, appointment, dismissal, and then institutional basis for execution of EU powers. So you could probably, this goes back to what I was talking about in my first video, with where you need to start. As you can see, I sort of just explained everything about the Commission, and then the TEU or the FEU explained in an article exactly what I was talking about. But then, as you can see, if you guys remember my last video, as I explained there as well, the TFEU went into the details of the same issue. This is what I mean by the sense where if you're going to write a test, it doesn't matter where you're from, you should start with the TEU because it usually brings the basis. You know, it just brings up the existence of a thing. In Sweden, the most applicable example is when you say something, någonting är grundlagsskyddat. Det betyder att du kan ta det därifrån ner till mindre lagar. Så du börjar med till exempel att domstolen eller högsta domstolen är grundlagsskyddad. Och sen så har du förvaltningsregler som hamnar längre ner. Men du hade inte kunnat förklara dessa förvaltningsregler om du inte börjar med grundlagsskyddet i RF 11.1 för högsta domstolar. Okay, anyways, back to English. Article 291 TFEU, implementing acts, member state apply binding acts, Commission may adopt implementing measures to ensure uniform application. Back to what I was talking about before. Member states do the deed, but the Commission needs to look at the deed and make sure that it was right. Article 337, Commissions may collect necessary information from member state to fulfill its tasks. Back again to what I was talking about, it just comes back to Article 17, TEU. It's just going further into details and it's giving further executive power to the Commission. Alright, financial powers. I'm just going to read these out. I'm going to make a separate video for this because I'm going to bring up a few thinkers from our time. I'm going to bring up the IMF, the gold standard removed from the Nixon administration during, I think it was, what was that, the 80s? When the gold standard was falling apart. The US was losing so much gold at such a rate that it wasn't feasible. Like they'd accidentally proven the inadequacy of capitalism. Literally they did. And then Nixon had to fix it. Oh man, Nixon was a very interesting presidency. Just his whole background. Makes you wonder, especially since he was the one who removed the gold standard. Nonetheless, I'm just going to read out the articles and then so that it can be within the prompt, but I'm not going to go into them. Article 310, 311, 314 until 316, and then you have Article 317, and then Article 318 until 319, TFEU, meaning FEUF for Swedish people. Yeah, and then remember, these are the three main institutions within these contexts, but then the EU has pretty much four big institutions, the fourth one being the EU Court. Thank you for watching.